Hello, welcome to 5 Minutes on What Causes Parkinson's Disease. Just let the terminology slide past you and gather what you may from it in taking a look at the diagrams. And by the end of the 5 minutes, you should have a grasp of the basic causes of Parkinson's. Here's a view of the surface of the brain, the upper surface, which is mostly cerebral cortex, particularly in higher mammals, where it's divided into two halves called hemispheres. And if you stretch this out flat, it would cover about 2 square meters containing 50 billion communicating cells called neurons. Of course, Parkinson's doesn't start here, but this is a sidetrack to get you to think about the number of neurons involved in this whole process and just neurons in general. Here's an inferior view of the same brain model where we see the brain stem consisting of pons and medulla that control the essential body functions of blood pressure and breathing. In front of that you see the hypothalamus, a small area in the center that controls sleep cycles, hormone cycles, blood pressure subtleties, stress hormone released by the pituitary gland. You also see the olfactory bulb, the frontal cortex. What's important is that all these areas in front of the brainstem require dopamine to function normally. Here's a side cross-section of the brain where the corpus callosum that connects the cerebral hemispheres is cut. The brainstem is split as well. Things that need dopamine to work normally include the hypothalamus, the frontal cortex, as was mentioned, and things in the midbrain, which we'll get into further. Where does this dopamine come from? It comes from an area called the substantia nigra, marked by the yellow X, which is a small area that sits atop the brainstem that contains neurons that produce dopamine. This is a schematic of neurons, and the cell body of the neuron on top would be like a dopamine neuron producing the neurotransmitter chemical dopamine. Dopamine is just a neurotransmitter that is dumped out at the synapse at the end of the axon. It's produced in the cell body, travels down through the axon to where it's needed, and it's dumped out when signaled. Here's a detailed view of schematic of the cell body sitting in the substantia nigra. Actually, there are 10 to 20,000 of them in each substantia nigra, one on each side. And you see we've taken one axon, brought it down, and shown how it divides into areas that synapse with other areas where dopamine is needed in the brain. And to the right is a more detailed view of that. In this diagram, you see the substantia nigra sitting atop the brainstem and a red series of extensions coming out. These are the axons that come out from the cell body that bring dopamine to the areas of the brain where it's needed, including the frontal cortex, the olfactory area, the hypothalamus, and the midbrain diencephalon, which you can't see here, but we'll see in the next diagram. Parkinson's disease, it occurs when 80% of these neurons are lost from the substantia nigra, and that's when you start to see symptoms, particularly related to the basal ganglia in the diencephalon. Diencephalon contains two important regions, the basal ganglia and the limbic system. They're intimately related. One controls movement, motivation, both of which are messed up in Parkinson's. The other, the limbic system, controls emotion and basic drive states, the 4Fs, fight, flight, feeding, and fornication, all of which are messed up in Parkinson's disease. This is a summary of the things that are deranged in Parkinson's disease. What I want to demonstrate is that Parkinson's disease is not just a disorder of movement where the basal ganglia are just involved, involving tremor, slowness, rigidity, diminished motivation, but there's also many other things which you see listed here, and you can stop the tape and look at the individual things. But just to say that many of the symptoms of Parkinson's are non-movement symptoms. So the question comes, why do these neurons from the substantia nigra mysteriously die in Parkinson's, such that by the time the classic movement symptoms of rigidity and tremor occur, 80% of the neurons are dead? Well, one thought is that it's a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental exposure. There are 10 or so genetic variations that lead to Parkinson's, and many different environmental things like insecticides, herbicides. And the question is, what how does this work? Well, there's a clumping of this bad protein called alpha-synuclein, and it's produced when a compound called dopal, which is from the breakdown of dopamine by monoamine oxidase, is released. Dopal is gotten rid of by aldehyde dehydrogenase, and interestingly enough, insecticides and some of those bad chemicals inhibit aldehyde dehydrogenase, raising dopal levels and increasing clumping of alpha-synuclein, causing cell death in Parkinson's. So that's a summary, 5 minutes on what causes Parkinson's disease.